from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Matthew and Kailey Leinz.
President Trump makes a move in the case of Jeffrey Epstein. Welcome to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kailey Leinz alongside Tyler Kendall in Washington, where the conversation has been dominated by controversy surrounding the release of information related to, of course, the convicted, now late, sex offender Epstein. President Trump now asking the Department of Justice, or authorizing them to ask a court to release some files related to Epstein. The question, of course, is will that be enough to assuage his supporters who want more transparency around this? And of course, Tyler, it comes after a Wall Street Journal report hit yesterday alleging that President Trump once sent a suggestive birthday letter to Epstein. The president says that letter was fake and is threatening to sue the Journal over that story. Right, and we should say the paper declined to comment on the president's litigation threat. Another big question here is whether or not the federal court would actually grant the administration's request to make public grand jury deliberations, because this is usually a pretty secretive process. Yeah, and of course, all of this is not what President Trump wants to spend today talking about. He's been pushing back heavily against the idea that this keeps coming up. He's hoping to shift focus perhaps just about an hour and a half from now as he's getting ready to sign into law the Genius Act, piece of legislation that will regulate stablecoins in the U.S. There's going to be a big ceremony with all the pomp and circumstance at the White House at 2:30 p.m. And we're actually going to speak with a congressman from the Financial Services Committee who cares very much about this effort when it comes to crypto regulation. Congressman Bill Huizenga is going to be joining us shortly. Right. This is considered to be a pretty big legislative achievement for the White House. But we also have to keep in mind it was crypto week in Congress, and they didn't accomplish everything that they ultimately wanted to. Some still big questions moving forward here about one of the other big bills, the Clarity Act, and how that's going to fare when it comes to making its way through the Senate next. Yeah, you still got to get through the upper chamber. So we'll keep track of all of those stories for you this hour, just as Charlie Pellet is keeping track of financial markets on this Friday. So let's check in with him now from New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much. Indeed, keeping track of a lot of red right now, just about the lows of the day on the S&P 500 index. Stocks have been fluctuating as traders parse a handful of earnings. Bond yields fell alongside the dollar as Fed Governor Chris Waller on Bloomberg television and radio reiterated his case for a July rate cut. So here's where we stand. We begin with the equity markets. S&P down 10 now at 62.87, drop there of 0.2%. The Dow lower by 246. Right now, Dow Industrials down 0.5%. And we have got NASDAQ down 30 for the NASDAQ Composite Index, a drop right now of just about 0.1%. Our Mag 7 index on a down day for the rest of the market is gaining 0.3%. 10-year 4.41%, the 2-year 3.85%, the 30-year 4.98%. Gold is up $14 the ounce, $33.53, up 0.4%. A retreat for crude oil down 0.2%, $67.39 a barrel. And Bitcoin, as we wrap up crypto week in Washington, down 1.5%. Right now, we've got Bitcoin 117,628. Netflix lower after earnings. Netflix shares they're tumbling now by 5.1%. And Balance of Power continues right now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Tyler Kendall and Kailey Leinz.
All right, Charlie Pellet checking on the markets for us. Thank you so much. On this Friday here in Washington, we're still talking about the very story that President Trump was initially hoping we wouldn't be talking about this entire week, and yet that's how it's played out as members of his own base of support push for greater transparency around material related to the case of the late convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. Of course, President Trump is now asking the Attorney General Pam Bondi to move forward and asking a court to authorize the release of some grand jury information. But it comes after a report in the Wall Street Journal last night alleging that President Trump, before he was president, once sent a suggestive birthday letter to Epstein for his 50th birthday. The president has called that story false, malicious, and defamatory. And as we've mentioned, Tyler is threatening to sue the Wall Street Journal, its parent company, and in fact, Rupert Murdoch over it. Right, exactly. And the paper did decline to reply to the litigation threat. But we really have started to see some of his supporters perhaps get behind this idea of fake news and attacking the media over this report. But there are still a lot of people out there that want to see some more information released and get some of these questions answered, which is where we start now with Bloomberg senior White House reporter Josh Wingrove, who's joining us here in our D.C. studio. Josh, can you just
put into context for us? Because it doesn't seem like this issue is going away for President Trump. How big of a political liability at the moment does the White House view this?
Well, the broader Epstein thing, I think, is still sort of a wildfire that is risking, consuming a lot of parts of the MAGA base. But the story maybe is a double-edged sword, right? Because right now the White House is trying to seize it as a rallying cry. Look, fake news. The president is being pursued again by the media and trying to sort of steer attention that way. But so far it hasn't worked. I mean, Trump has tried a lot of things to steer attention away from this. It just hasn't been successful. And you have allies like Charlie Kirk and others who are saying that this case is sort of like part and parcel with all his base's concerns about the deep state and these hidden theories and whatever, including, we should probably call them conspiracies at some end of the flank. But that is why they're so upset. They thought that they would get clarity from Trump on this. It's not coming out. So it's less that they are worried that he himself might be involved in it, which of course is the sort of question raised by this journal story, just how close was Donald Trump with Jeffrey Epstein. But more the broad question is they felt that essentially that they were sold the bill of goods and they, want those goods, and they're not getting them so far. So we'll see. Right now, it's unclear. Remember, of course, there's been questions about Pam Bondi's future. Right. Trump has really stood by her. I find it personally difficult to see how he would do anything but that, because it just doesn't make sense that she'd be acting solo here. I mean, she's in lockstep with the president on this. So we don't know where it will go, but this has divided the mega base in a way that we have not seen at all anything close to this in the second term. But it's also, early to say how it'll play out.
Yeah, well, and when it comes to Pam Bondi, she's saying she'll do as the president has asked, and authorize the DOJ to seek release of this grand jury testimony. But seeking it and actually getting it released are two very different things, Josh. So is this enough to lower the pressure for now?
Well, and if it's not released, or if only partially released, that could fuel beliefs that this is part of some grand cover-up. And, Trump loved to stoke this. I mean, he has drawn a lot of political energy from questions about who knew what about Epstein and who was involved with him and where was there a client list. This was a tailwind for Trump. And now, of course, it's potentially backfiring on him with, people wondering why they're not getting the documents that they have. Democrats, have a tough road to walk here. There are so many other things happening this week. I mean, I don't know. Happy Friday, I think. Is it Friday? What day is it?
Thank God. Yes, it is.
Right. And Democrats would like, in some ways, this is like a potent thing that is ripping apart proverbially the mega coalition. On the other hand, Democrats would love to draw attention to some of the other things Trump is doing, including the bill passage earlier this month, of his big, beautiful bill and some of the tax cuts therein. And remember, it was only like this week that Trump is, really ratcheting up his war with Jay Powell. So a lot of moving parts here right now.
Well, to build on that, let's talk about some of those actual legislative victories that the White House did see this week. The $9 billion rescissions package, also this crypto legislation, the Genius Act. President Trump has a big bill signing today, in a short time, actually, at the White House. What do we know about how the White House is trying to capitalize on those headlines instead? Yeah,
they're very excited about that rescissions package as well, because, of course, it looked a little bumpy there. They had to tweak some of the stuff around PEPFAR. And Trump is due to dine with Republican senators tonight. So the sort of in-person politicking has always been a preference of his. They want to be talking about these. The White House believes that it's on a winning streak right now, and that they have a message to share not only to their base to say, hey, we're delivering on the stuff we told you we would, but also to the broader electorate. And we'll see if it shows up in these poll numbers. But yeah, they're on a winning streak right now. They want to talk about these things. And once these bills sort of get through and, they clear the decks on a couple of other things, I think then one question to watch for is, will we get any more Tom Tillises? Will we get anyone that is like, has been a team player until now, but maybe now starts to come forward with stuff that they're not jazzed about, as Senator Tillis has. Of course, he's not seeking re-election, so the threat of a primary challenge is going away. So we'll see. But right now, Trump loves to complain that Republicans aren't marching in lockstep. They've been getting stuff done in the last month or so, so they have been in pretty lockstep recently.
Against what some would have described as long odds. they have been able to do so.
Narrow
Josh
majorities
Wingrove,
in the House, for sure.
Bloomberg senior White House reporter. Thank you so much. And as we consider that crypto bill, especially in the moment it marks for an industry that has been lobbying hard here in Washington for years now for something like this to materialize, Tyler, it's also worth pointing out that they have a lot of money powering them too. And they are a force as we look ahead to the midterms in 2026. They're likely to be spending money like we saw in 2024.
Exactly. And we've already seen figures from Fairshake, for example, one of the super PACs and its affiliated PACs that has an enormous amount of cash on hand already, because even though it feels like we already just got through an election here in Washington, we're already preparing for 2026. And when you do look at how slim the majorities are in both chambers, this is a political faction, a pile of money that lawmakers on both sides of the aisle are going to try to capitalize on.
Well, yeah, that's absolutely true. And perhaps that's why lawmakers are putting more focus on actually getting this legislation across, despite what at least some Democrats have suggested are ethics concerns around the way in which legislation like this could actually serve to benefit President Trump and his wider family. Those ethics questions, I'm sure, will have to wait for another day. I wouldn't imagine President Trump is going to address them at the signing ceremony later on today. But we want to talk more about this legislation with a member now of the House Financial Services Committee who is here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio on this Friday, Republican Congressman Bill Huizenga, representing Michigan's 4th District. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and Radio, Congressman. Nice to see you in person.
Good to be with you, yeah.
As well. It's been a big week in your chamber. It's going to be a big day.
Yeah, this week has been a hell of a month, I tell you.
Yeah, maybe it should have been reframed as crypto marathon rather than crypto week.
It was something else. But, you know, look, a lot of us have been involved in this for a very long time. And I understand that this might be hitting some of our colleagues a little fresher than certainly what those of us who have been diving into this for a number of years have been having to wrestle with. But, you know, this is an important, I think, an important statement for us with the Genius Act. Was it my first choice? No, the House was my first choice, a House version of that, but very satisfied with where we ended up on Genius. And, you know, my family's involved in construction back in Michigan, and we build houses. And the first thing you do is you pour the walls and the footings. You know, that's the foundation, literally. And then you go from there. And I think that's what we're going to be working on next.
Well, to build off of this, we're talking about the Genius Act.
Unintended on the build off of it.
Well, you're talking about the Genius Act and perhaps some of the changes that you didn't want to see made. But let's talk also about the Clarity Act, because now that heads to the Senate. What's your message to colleagues in that chamber when it comes to keeping that legislation perhaps as it is? Yeah,
well, we think it's a good product. We certainly wouldn't have put it forward if we didn't. And again, a lot of time and effort has been put into this. And I get it. There's a lot of folks that are getting educated at a level that they maybe necessarily hadn't been at previously. And I'm not saying that about Senate banking or anything like that. I'm talking about general colleagues that have to then go out and vote for these things. But we think it's a very good, solid product that Chairman Hill and Stile and a number of us and others, Barr, that have been working on this. Warren Davidson. These are folks that have been really doing the heavy lifting over a number of years. And then obviously over on the Senate side, we have colleagues that have done that as well. And so hopefully we're going to be able to come together. I hope that they lightly edit the House version of that. But yeah, it is essential, though, that we not stop. And it's key that we keep moving forward with this because we have to add the infrastructure, the plumbing on all of this.
Well, and of course, the Clarity Act is supposed to divvy up authority between the SEC and the CFTC. Yeah. And the new SEC chair, Paul Atkins, actually joined our colleagues on Bloomberg Surveillance earlier today talking about how he's viewing this specifically. This is what he said.
We are out to, obviously change direction at the SEC, and I think we've already done that. We're moving away from regulation through enforcement and uncertainty in the markets, especially with respect to cryptocurrencies and digital assets in general. And we're looking to set firm, clear rules of the road for people who are operating in that environment.
I wonder about the sense of urgency here, knowing that the SEC now is far less adversarial, shall we say, to this industry. Is there as much urgency in trying to make sure that the CFTC gets more authority over these assets?
Well, look, you got to go back and look at what had happened previously under Gary Gensler, right? And of course, when he was head of the CFTC, everything was a commodity. And when he became head of the SEC, everything magically became a security. And the simple truth is that these things are not either fish or fowl. I always say it's a platypus. It's got characteristics of both in many ways. And it's up to Paul Atkins, as well as the legislation that we're passing, to compel them to come up with what those rules of the road are. And what we saw in the last administration was basically Chair Gensler just making it up as he was going along. And that's not acceptable, because it doesn't give predictability. It doesn't give surety of a direction. And I've got great confidence in Paul Atkins and in what he's going to be doing on that. But again, we can't just sit back and say, okay, we declare victory, we don't have to do anything more. This is really just that first step.
I want to drill down a little bit on the bill that we're seeing signed into law today. When it comes to the Genius Act, stable coins, we have this great story out on the terminal today from actually our colleagues at Bloomberg Government that says that everyone's going to rush to register. But the thing is, when it comes to the OCC, the comptroller of the currency, where everyone's going to be going, they're facing actually a shrinking workforce. There are DOGE cuts that have hit the agency. Do you think that there is bandwidth among our regulators to meet what is expected to be this surge in demand? Yeah,
in general, I do. I think that the regulators have to make sure they are prioritizing what their actions are as well. That would be the argument many of us have had over the last 4 years. We've wandered far afield from where those regulators should be. And they were into whether it was ESG and into all kinds of other things that were not necessarily about materiality. They weren't necessarily about safety and soundness and consumer protection. And so, again, I think if they focus in, we're going to be fine on them being able to do that. Is there going to be this bump coming in? Of course. I mean, there's a lot of pent-up demand, and frankly, not many people bought the idea of just come in and register over the last 4 years, and all will be fine. I mean, that they didn't buy that, so there's a lot of people that were holding back, waiting for this moment so that we could get that clarity. And this is good for the U.S. dollar. It's good for our preeminence in the world. It adds to the safety and soundness of not just our currency and our money, but for those that are doing the investing. It makes it, not frictionless, but less friction in transactions. So I think this is going to be good for the economy as well.
Well, when we consider the safety and soundness and the credibility of the U.S. economy, monetary policy and its credibility also plays a role there. And I ask you this as the vice chair of the House Financial Services Committee. It's one thing for President Trump to suggest he'd like to see lower interest rates. It's another for administration officials to actively be pushing for the chair of the Federal Reserve to resign, suggesting he should be investigated for fraud. Do you see risk here of doing what could be permanent damage to the Fed's independence and therefore credibility by extension?
I believe in an independent Fed that is important now. As Chair Hill yesterday, when he was asked about this in a press conference, started
None of
going.
You can avoid it, can you?
But he started going through the litany of what was going on with LBJ and with Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan and others. Jimmy Carter. I mean, there's been plenty of pressure that has been applied to the Fed and Fed chairs and Fed officials over the decades, and because they are independent doesn't mean that they are somehow absent of any criticism or absent of any critique. And I think as we've seen a few folks sort of breathlessly say, the Fed chair is going to get fired, the president's going to do this. He himself addressed that, walked that back to add clarity to make sure that wasn't happening. And look, his term is going to be up soon. That's going to be the opportunity in my mind where the president's going to be able to really assert himself. Now, does it mean that he needs to do a better job? Yes.
All right, we'll leave it there. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us. The Vice Chair of the House Financial Services Committee, Congressman representing Michigan's 4th District, Bill Huizenga, here with us in studio on Balance of Power, live from Washington, D.C. I'm Kailey Leinz alongside Tyler Kendall, and we'll have more straight ahead here on this Friday edition, so stick with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kailey Leinz alongside Tyler Kendall here in Washington, where there's really only one story that everyone is talking about on this Friday, and it's perhaps not the story President Trump would prefer we be discussing, but it, of course, is the push within his base for the release of more information related to the late convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, with questions not just about the case itself and whether or not there is a client list that officials within the Trump administration had previously suggested did exist, but also into the president's relationship with Epstein, as the Wall Street Journal published a report alleging that President Trump sent a suggestive letter to Epstein for his 50th birthday, a report that the president denies is called defamatory and has threatened to sue the Wall Street Journal over. But he's also pointing a finger today, Tyler, at Democrats, or I guess, yeah, this is today, earlier this morning on Truth Social, saying if there was a smoking gun on Epstein, why didn't the Dems, who controlled the files for 4 years and had Garland and Comey in charge, use it? He ends it, all caps, because they had nothing.
Right. This is part of the White House's defense here, since this story really does seem to have that sticking power. We're now seeing a movement in Congress even to force a formal vote on releasing these files, as it really does appear to have this grip on really both sides of the party here. And that's perhaps becoming a political liability for the president. And that's where we want to start today by bringing in our political panel. It includes Rick Davis, partner at Stonecourt Capital and a Bloomberg politics contributor, and Christina Greer, associate chair at the Department of Political Science at Fordham. Rick, I want to start with you, because where do we go from here? We have President Trump granting this authorization, but it's unclear if a federal court would even grant the administration's request. Could that potentially throw a wrench in the administration's plan, since they appear to be wanting to give those that are seeking more information something to chew on?
Yeah, I almost think that that's what the White House wants, right, is so that they can wake up and then start attacking the judiciary again, saying, oh, well, I wanted you to have this information, but the courts won't let you have it. Of course, I don't think it was a coincidence that they went after the most sensitive information you can have, which is grand jury testimony, which is supposed to remain secret. Forget the files you already have at the FBI and in the Justice Department that can be released tomorrow. So, look, Biden didn't release this stuff for some reason, and Trump doesn't want to release this stuff for some reason. My guess is there may be not much to it all, and that the only reason the president has actually bowed to this effort is by his own claim is because the publicity was bad for him. And so all he's done is kept the publicity going into this weekend. So we'll have a nice, thorough Sunday show, spectacular, with more Jeffrey Epstein, and who knows? Now everybody's got an investigative journalist looking for more Epstein material, like the Wall Street Journal came up with. I mean, it is a classic summer scandal.
Indeed. And we are in mid-July. As we consider, though, Christina, the sentiment around this, obviously there are loud voices that have always been loud voices within the MAGA base who have made a very big deal about this, thinking of the likes of Laura Loomer. But there's another question of the broader Republican electorate. We've gotten a few polls this week, one from Quinnipiac, that shows there is some division among Republicans on this issue. 40% say they approve of the way the administration is handling the Epstein files. 36% disapprove, 24% did not give an opinion. There were similar divisions in a Reuters Ipsos poll. 35% approve of the handling, 29% disapprove. Is the fracturing of the Republican, or more specifically the president's base, a real tangible thing here?
Well, it appears that this is the first time we've seen real fissures within the base. I mean, this is also a base that's been fed a consistent diet of conspiracy theories that the president has sort of promoted and then walked away from. We can start with the birther conspiracy theory, and then when Obama acquiesces and shows his birth certificate, where he is indeed American, the president says, well, that must be a hoax and it must be fake, right? The Pizzagate scandal with the Clintons and Hillary Clinton and the basement and pedophilia. He's also fed them a consistent diet of, Democrats are somehow attached to pedophiles. The difference is Jeffrey Epstein, this isn't a conspiracy theory. He was convicted for being inappropriate with minors. And so now that he has fed this base for many, many years, certain narratives, he wants to walk away, and they're not willing to walk away. And so I think what's been interesting about this particular story for a lot of journalists on both sides of the aisle is that we have not seen the base sort of disavow something that the president has said. They have moved and shifted and twisted themselves into pretzels on a dime as the president changes his whims. And this particular instance we have a significant portion of his base who are saying, actually, I don't agree with you. I want to get to the bottom of this, whatever it is. And so it seems as though the president can't shake it. We know, obviously, the administration would like to shake it, considering they're releasing health information, which they never do about the president, as a distraction, and it hasn't distracted his base. And so we will see whether or not it's the courts, whether or not it's Congress, whether or not he can sort of keep pushing this off on Biden and Obama and the Democrats. But at some point in time, his base, a significant portion, wants some information, and he'll have to give them something.
Well, this really has become a top issue here in Washington, but also nationwide. In fact, over here in Bloomberg, we had New York City Mayor Eric Adams on the Odd Lots podcast earlier. We want to play you both a little bit of what he said about what he's looking for, what Attorney General Pam Bondi might soon be releasing or not.
I would love to see what's in those Epstein files. I think we all do. I'm eager to look at UFOs. There's so many history. I'm still trying to figure out who killed Kennedy. I look forward to seeing there's so many deep secrets in America that I think we all want to know. And it's imperative that as much as we can find out as possible.
Rick, perhaps, can you shed some of your insight here? Does this have anything to do with perhaps the sticking power that we're seeing this story really have a grip on members in both parties as they try to seek more answers? Does Eric Adams' argument there have some credibility?
Not really. I mean, I too would like to see the UFOs. Whenever I'm in New York, I feel like walking around the street, I see one UFO after another. But that's, more a comment on the residents of New York. The reality is that this was really sort of a Trump-instigated problem, right? And sure, there's a lot here that is disturbing to people. Court cases were tried, people were convicted. Jeffrey Epstein killed himself. And the only people who continued to talk about this wasn't necessarily the Democratic Party. It was the Republicans who said, oh, my God, they're keeping these files secret for a reason. There are all kinds of people. They implied Bill Clinton and others had exposure to this. And it was one of the classic MAGA kind of influenced messages. And we went through a lot of those over the last, 10 years. And virtually every single one of them has sort of fallen on deaf ears. And this one has gotten some new traction because the president himself has indicated a willingness to show people something that they hadn't seen before on it. It wasn't really that big an issue until, Pam Bondi said, I'm going to release these records, and then didn't release anything that wasn't already in the public domain. So they are tripping over themselves on this issue. And the reality is, I think when you look at sort of good crisis management, you tell everybody, everyone be quiet. We're going to speak with one single voice. It will be someone who is not the president of the United States, and will draw attention to only that person and only the messages that they give, and tell everyone else to be quiet. I mean, we still don't know Dan Bongino's future as deputy of the FBI, which to me is the most important thing here, because he's supposed to be running the day-to-day operations of the FBI and has somehow been embroiled in this scandal to the point where he didn't show up for work for a couple of days. Now, that is unacceptable to most taxpayers.
Well, we're also maybe wondering about Bongino's future. We're also wondering about Eric Adams, who we just heard from's future, whether or not he can end up being reelected mayor of New York City. I would point out, Christina, that on Odd Lots with Joe Weisenthal and Tracy Alloway, they talked about a lot more than just Epstein. That full conversation can be found on Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcast. But they, no surprise, talked about the mayoral race. And specifically, Adams had some choice criticism for Zohran Mamdani, who, of course, is the Democratic nominee, specifically his attitude when it comes to billionaires. You're up at Fordham. You know New York politics well, knowing Mamdani is set to meet with the House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries in New York today. What does he need to do to actually win this thing in the general, knowing it's not just Adams that he's up against, but Andrew Cuomo as well, with this weird independent factor we don't usually see?
Right. So first things first, Rick, as a native New Yorker, I would say that we are very welcoming to aliens and non-aliens and especially tourists from other places. So we'll just put that out there. But Zohran Mamdani, going into the general election, we have to remember it's not ranked choice voting the way we saw in the Democratic primary. He's going up against not just current mayor Eric Adams, three-term governor Andrew Cuomo, the Republican nominee, and also another prominent lawyer, independent nominee Jim Walden. So there are 5 people currently in the race, to say nothing of all the small names that are always on a ballot. This 33-year-old state legislator, has to sort of capture the attention. I talk about this every week on my podcast, FAQ, which is the real estate community, the business community, the labor community, and the Hasidic community. Those are the 4 communities that can make or break a mayor's chances of getting across the finish line. And it is first past the post. It is not a 50% majority that is needed. It is whoever gets the most votes becomes the 111th mayor of New York City. And so Mamdani, who's relatively unknown to the business community, he's relatively unknown to the labor community, which is incredibly diverse. He's definitely unknown to the real estate community and also to the Hasidic community. And there are lots of conversations that he's had about Israel and domestic versus international policy that he's attempting to clarify and sort of provide more nuance. So this is, a summer where he's a fantastic campaigner, but we know that campaigning is not governance. And so part of what he's trying to do is to convince a large portion of New Yorkers that he actually can govern. We've had abysmal turnout over the past few elections where we are electing mayors with, barely 25%. I think we will see a high turnout election just because we have Republicans who may go with the Republican nominee, Curtis Sliwa, or they may be more inclined to go with someone like Eric Adams or even an Andrew Cuomo because they think that those individuals can negotiate with Donald Trump in a better fashion.
All right, Christina Greer and Rick Davis, our political panel on this Friday edition of Balance of Power from the New York mayoral race to Epstein. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Kailey Leinz alongside Tyler Kendall, and we'll have more coming up here on Bloomberg TV and radio. A week, of course, that has been dominated by many of the headlines we've discussed so far here on Balance of Power, from what's happened legislatively in Congress to what's going on with the Jeffrey Epstein case and how that's engulfing the Trump administration. But also, of course, the ongoing saga of President Trump and his relationship to the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, and whether or not Chairman Powell is going to be safe in his job for much longer. Of course, the president suggests he does not intend at this time to fire Chairman Powell, but that is not stopping him from pressuring Powell to lower interest rates. Seems we see this every day now on Truth Social, including a post this morning. Too late, his nickname for Chairman Powell, and the Fed are choking out the housing market with their high rate, making it difficult for people, especially the young, to buy a house. He goes on to say, Tyler, that the U.S. is rocking. There is very low inflation, and we deserve to be, he says, at 1%. Of course, that is far below where the Fed funds rate currently is.
Right, and we actually had asked Joe Livornia, counselor to Secretary Bessent yesterday about this. Perhaps we'll have to see where they actually end up thinking that the Fed funds rate should shake out. But it is apparent that the administration feels bolstered by what has been positive economic data, retail sales yesterday, University of Michigan consumer sentiment today, all, of course, factors when we are talking about this pressure campaign from the White House. And actually, our colleagues earlier today on Bloomberg Television sat down with the Federal Reserve Governor Christopher Waller. You heard Charlie mention it earlier on surveillance. He is, of course, seen as a potential replacement for Jerome Powell, and he hinted himself that he would dissent if his colleagues end up holding rates steady in their July meeting. We want to bring you part of that conversation now, including starting out with some of his thoughts on the Trump administration's tariff policies.
Tariffs are a tax, and in public finance, you learn that you may levy a tax on a firm, but who bears the incidence or the burden of that tax? It can be a group of people or one person, not necessarily the firm. So this is what I've heard from a lot of firms. If there's a 10% tax, they'll force their suppliers to eat some of that cost. Workers may eat some of that cost in terms of less hiring and things like that. The firm will take it out of their profit margins. And then lastly, some of it will get passed on. And as I mentioned last night, I've heard this for months now. Like the rule is 10%, it's roughly, rule of thumb is a third, a third, a third. Suppliers will eat a third, firms will eat a third, consumers are going to eat a third of that tariff. So if you eat a third of it and it's 10%, like I've been arguing, this is like 3/10 on the inflation rate for a few months, and that's it. And it'll persist if you do 12-month over 12-month. That base effect will not go away for a while, and then it'll just drop off a cliff. So that's why I've been arguing you want to look at like 3 months and 6 months to see if these tariff effects pop up and then go away. And so that's more critical than looking at 12 months.
Yes, but the way the president is putting these tariffs on might not match up with theory, Chris. The Smoot-Hawley tax was passed and came into effect on a certain date. The president is not yet put on most of these tariffs. They're, in theory, still coming. And we still haven't seen the Section 232 tariffs, for the most part, the national defense tariffs that he wants to put on semiconductors and pharmaceuticals, et cetera. So if the process is stretched out, consumers could be hit by an ongoing series of tariff increases. And given what they've just been through, isn't there a danger that inflation psychology starts to seep in?
Well, that's exactly the point. All my example has been is if you put the 10% uniform tariff on and keep it roughly in that range, then what I've described is what will happen. If there's constantly a sequence of higher and higher and higher tariffs, then you are going to get this rolling potential impact on prices. That's true. If it's still just a question of delaying it, that doesn't change my argument. Whether you see the spike in July or it happens in August or September, when it happens is irrelevant for the economics. That's a non-starter of an argument. Firms could also just spread it out in smaller increments over several months. The total effect still ends up being the same. They just get there in a later fashion, and it'll be smaller amounts. So the bigger thing is if we just continually get another wave of tariffs, another wave of tariffs, another waves of tariffs, that's when things become more problematic, thinking about what's going to happen with inflation.
Fed Governor Christopher Waller in conversation with our colleagues on Bloomberg Surveillance, including Bloomberg's very own Mike McKee earlier today, talking about tariffs and the unknown factor that it plays, an unknown policy that exists around them, which, of course, is one of the reasons that the Federal Reserve is maintaining, at least for now, that it feels comfortable where it is, keeping rates on hold until it has more clarity around that specific element and how it will influence the economy. But of course, President Trump does not want the Fed to be on hold, as we mentioned once again today, pushing the Fed to lower interest rates. He believes the Fed should be down at 1%. That would be substantial cuts from where we are now. And we want to get into this and other issues as we turn now to Natasha Sarin. She's professor at the Yale Budget Lab, former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy, and former counselor to the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, at the Treasury Department. Natasha, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. When we consider the president, who in that True Social post, as he pushed for a 1% Fed funds rate, talked about how that rate would save the U.S. $1 trillion a year in terms of the interest payments that we have to make. Is that really how it will work in reality? If that is the narrative he is pushing, the Fed cuts rates, it makes our financial situation fiscally as a nation much easier?
So the challenge that we kind of have to grapple with is that the Federal Reserve and the Federal Reserve's independence is really crucial to the role that it's able to play in the economy as a stabilizer. So when the Federal Reserve makes decisions, it has two things in mind. It has what does the employment picture look like and what does inflation look like? And it's reacting to those two particular, really substantive data questions. If you're in a universe where instead a Federal Reserve that's become politicized is reacting to what President Trump thinks that the interest rates should be, well, in that situation, you kind of break the relationship between what the Federal Reserve actually gets to set, which is the federal funds rate, the rate at which banks lend to one another, and things like mortgage rates or car loan rates or small business loan rates that are like actually relevant to consumers in this economy. So perversely, by sort of trying to push so aggressively for an interest rate that is way outside of the realm of what any economic observers think makes sense in an environment where employment is basically at 4-ish% and inflation is still not back to target and in fact ticking upward because of this tariff policy, you really don't have any case to make for those type of rate choices outside of just politicization of the Federal Reserve, which comes with real risks.
I'm also hoping, Natasha, that you can give us a little bit more context here, too, because we have to keep in mind that the Fed chair is only one vote on the Federal Open Market Committee. And we did speak to Bill Pulte, the head of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, who told us earlier this week on Balanced Power that they are seeking for Powell to step down as chair, but also his position on the board. Can you just give us a little bit, could this complicate the administration's ultimate goal here when you do have other members who are voting and what we are hearing from those other members when it does come to the future of rate cuts?
And, you know, it's like really important for your viewers, I think, and listeners to understand, like, there is no sort of button that the Fed chair pushes to change the interest rate. The way that it works, as you're describing, is the Federal Reserve Chair is one of 12 members on the Federal Open Markets Committee that makes decisions. They meet 8 times a year. They make decisions on the trajectory of the interest rate. And importantly, these are decisions that are made by a group of people. And so the Fed chair, even if the president was effective at getting a Fed chair in who was going to push for his desired rate cuts that he's sort of trying to effectuate from the top in ways that break Federal Reserve independence, well, the rest of the board is going to be in a situation, and the rest of the committee is going to be in a situation where they're actually trying to push against exactly that impulse because they want to preserve the independence of the Federal Reserve, both because they are sort of institutionally very concerned about it, but also because only then can we be in a situation where we are actually trusted and credible as being reactive to inflation and being reactive to the employment picture. And what's important for your viewers, listeners also to understand is, like, we in some sense have run this experiment before. Like, President Nixon put a ton of pressure on the Federal Reserve to cut rates in ways that would be short-term politically expedient. They did. And as a result of that, you saw inflation tick up from 3% to 13% over the course of 2 years in ways that required a massive course correction and led to a significant downturn. So, like, I don't think anyone should be rooting for that in this country. And it certainly goes against what the Trump administration is hoping to see from an economic perspective.
Yeah, the historical context is important to keep in mind here, Natasha, and I appreciate you pointing that out. As you talk about the idea of trust and credibility for the Federal Reserve, I also wonder about the trust and credibility of the president as we consider his very frequently changing deadlines when it comes to tariff and trade policy, because this is what the Fed is having to contend with, why it makes their decision-making perhaps so hard. How do you at Budget Lab even try to game out the tariffs and the likely revenue we are going to be getting from them when the deadlines keep moving and the numbers keep changing? Is it even really possible to model?
I mean, we are doing our best. My colleagues and I at the Budget Lab are sort of tracing every single twist and turn with respect to tariff policy in this country. And, you know, to our count, we've seen the effective tariff rate change like almost 60 times over the course of the last several months as a result of the president's different political policies that have been pursued in this trade war. The thing that I think is like really important to grapple with, and you heard actually Governor Waller say a version of this, you've heard Chair Powell say a version of this as well. The president's been like super specific. He would like to see interest rates lower. Sort of Chair Powell and the rest of the Fed have been pretty specific as well that in a world in which this sort of uncertainty associated with trade policy didn't exist, the Federal Reserve would have already cut. And so you're in a world where it is hard in some sense to even game out what exactly the tariffs are meant to be for. Are they tools for revenue raising? Are they sort of important in order to balance our strategic alignment with vis-a-vis an adversary like China? Are they really about bringing manufacturing back into the United States? And the result of that is no one, you, I, and certainly not the business community, has any sense where these tariffs are actually fundamentally going to land. And that creates a difficulty that we can disagree about what the right effective tariff rate should be in the economy. But certainly this sort of start-stop that makes it impossible really to plan with any sense of where policy is ultimately going to land makes it really challenging to think, as an estimator, certainly very challenging to think about what the likely revenue consequences are going to be. But certainly as a business trying to make investment decisions makes it incredibly complicated to think about that as well.
Natasha, just in our final minute, I want to build off of this because we did see Michigan consumer sentiment for July today come in above estimates. What are we learning when there is uncertainty, though, about the consumer's tolerance here, since confidence at one point was plunging amid tariff concerns, but today's data did show it at a 5-month high?
You know, I think it's really hard to make too much out of any one particular data point. We also got data this week about inflation that showed that in certain particular industries, if you look at things like consumer electronics, or if you look at things like household furnishings, which is a category that includes furniture, industries or sub-industries where the tariffs are likely to have substantial bite, you're starting to see an uptick in prices. I don't want to make too much of any one particular data point other than to tell you that the result of our estimates at Yale Budget Lab, which are trying to stay current with respect to where the president says tariffs are going to be come August 1st, this next deadline, is that consumers are going to see a $2,800 on average decrease in their in their household income as a result of higher prices. And for the bottom of the distribution, that's on top of something that you all have been talking a great deal about, which is these important cuts to social programs like Medicaid that have been recently effectuated. So I think there's a lot here that's pretty important.
Natasha, we have to leave it there. Natasha Sarin of Yale Budget Lab here with us on Balance of Power. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back for more at 5 p.m. right here on Bloomberg TV and Radio.